You're deep in the jungle, in the middle of a war zone. You know your enemy is tracking you, and a clash could be imminent. You move with extreme caution, taking every precaution imaginable. Then you take one more step, and suddenly the ground gives way beneath you. You've walked straight into a trap. There is no explosion, there is no gunfire, there is no enemy in sight. There is only sound that the men who heard it never forgot: a wet, splitting crunch, and a soldier going down where he stood. His foot has punched straight through a thin lid of woven grass and packed earth, into a pit no wider than a dinner plate, and waiting at the bottom were the stakes. Sharpened bamboo, angled upward, driven so deep into the soil that they could not give way. By the time his own weight had told him what was happening, it was already finished. The rest of the patrol freezes. Not because they are under attack, but because the ground itself has just become the enemy. Every man looks down at his own feet, and in that single moment, a war fought with helicopters, napalm, and the most advanced military on Earth was quietly losing to a weapon that cost nothing, made no noise, and had been buried in the dirt by a farmer with a knife. This is the story of the punji stake, the simplest weapon of the Vietnam War and one of the most feared. Here is what makes it so disturbing, and we are going to take all of it apart piece by piece. The punji stake was almost never built to kill you. That was the entire point. The people who made these traps wanted you alive, wounded, and slowed down, and that choice was not cruelty for its own sake. It was cold, patient strategy. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a wounded American soldier was worth far more to the Viet Cong than a dead one. You will see how a stick of bamboo managed to drain the resources of a superpower, why the wound itself was often the least dangerous part of the whole thing, and how a weapon this primitive pushed the United States Army into redesigning the very boots its soldiers walked in. So let's begin with what these traps actually were, because the genius of them is hidden in the smallest details. Sometimes perfection lies in simplicity. A punji stake is nothing more than a sharpened piece of wood taken to its logical extreme. A length of bamboo or hardwood is sharpened to a fine point, and that point is then hardened in a fire until it is tough enough to pierce leather. Several of these stakes are then planted upright in the bottom of a shallow pit. The pit is covered with a light framework of twigs and grass, topped with a thin layer of soil, camouflaged so carefully that even a cautious person moving slowly and paying close attention would have difficulty distinguishing it from the surrounding ground. And that is the weapon. In principle, it is something that almost anyone at any time could make. No metal, no powder, no moving parts. A child could build one, and across Vietnam many did. And that simplicity was not a weakness. It was the source of all its power. The technique was old, far older than the Americans who would come to dread it. The Vietnamese had used sharpened stakes against the French during the First Indochina War and against invaders long before that. By the time American troops arrived in force in the mid-1960s, this was not improvisation. It was refined, inherited knowledge, passed down and perfected. And the men who set these traps had been doing it in one form or another for generations. So when we picture who was building them, set aside the image of a uniformed army. These were mostly Viet Cong guerrillas, local fighters who knew this ground because they had grown up walking it, working alongside villagers who could turn a quiet afternoon into the construction of a weapon that might disable a soldier weeks later. That is what made it impossible to fight. You cannot bomb an idea that lives in the hands of an entire countryside. But to really understand the fear, you have to understand the engineering, because there is far more thought in these traps than the materials suggest. The first refinement was the angle. The stakes were rarely set straight up. They were leaned inward, angled so that the point pierced the foot or lower leg on the way down. And then, when the soldier instinctively tried to pull free, the barbs and angled tips bit deeper and tore on the way out. Some stakes were carved with a notch or a backward hook near the point, so that pulling against them did more damage than the initial wound. The trap was designed around the victim's own reaction. It used your panic against you. The second refinement was the placement, and this is where the patience comes in. These pits were not scattered at random. They were set exactly where a tired soldier was most likely to step, on the soft edge of a trail where men naturally move to avoid the hard center, beside a fallen log that a soldier would step over and land behind, on the approach to a stream near a likely landing zone, along the dikes of a rice paddy. The Viet Cong studied how American patrols moved, where they rested, where they took cover when the first shots came, and they seeded those exact spots. Sometimes a trap was placed precisely where a man would dive for safety during an ambush, so that the enemy's gunfire would drive him straight onto the stakes. Hold on to that detail, because it tells you everything about the mind behind these weapons. This was not a blunt instrument. This was a trap built around human behavior. And the simple pit was only the most basic version. Over time, the same idea grew into a whole family of traps, each one tuned to a different way of catching a man. There were shallow foot traps barely deeper than the sole of a boot, set in their dozens along a single path, so that finding and clearing one told you nothing at all about the next. There were deep pits wide enough to swallow a leg to the thigh, lined with stakes on every side, so they struck home no matter how a man fell into them. There were sideways traps that swung a spike board into the ankle the instant a hidden tripwire was touched. What united all of them was the camouflage, and this is where the real craftsmanship lived. The lid had to match the ground exactly, the same leaves, the same shade of soil, the same scatter of twigs, rebuilt so naturally that the jungle itself seemed to have closed over it. A trap you can see is just a hole in the ground. A trap you cannot see is a weapon that thinks for itself. And now we get to the part that turns this from a nasty surprise into something genuinely chilling, the question that sits underneath the entire video. Why go to all this trouble to wound a man instead of kill him? Because the answer reveals the real weapon, and it was never the bamboo. Think about what happens on the battlefield when a soldier dies. It is a tragedy, but tactically, it is over. The man is gone, and the unit keeps moving. Now think about what happens when a soldier is wounded, badly in the foot in the middle of dense jungle, miles from the nearest base. He cannot walk, he cannot fight, he is screaming, and that sound does something to the men around him. Two of his comrades have to stop fighting to carry him. A radio operator has to call for a medevac helicopter. That helicopter has to be fueled, crewed, and flown into a hostile area where it becomes a slow, loud target hovering over the trees. Medics, supplies, and hospital beds are all consumed by one man and one sharpened stick. So do the arithmetic the way the Viet Cong did. One cheap, silent, disposable weapon does not remove one enemy from the war. It removes a handful of them, at least for hours, sometimes for good. It slows an entire patrol to a crawl, because now every step is a gamble. It forces a powerful industrial army to spend helicopters, fuel, medicine, and manpower on a problem created by a man with a knife in an afternoon. A dead soldier costs the enemy nothing more. A wounded soldier costs them everything, again and again. That was the strategy. The punji stake was not really aimed at the body. It was aimed at the war machine itself, and it was devastatingly efficient. Multiply that across a country, seeded with these traps, trail after trail and province after province, and you begin to see the true scale of it. Not one wounded man, but a steady grinding tax on time, equipment, and morale, paid every single day by the strongest army in the world, to an enemy who could replace every weapon he lost with an hour of work and a fresh stick of bamboo. There was one more layer to the cruelty, and it is the detail that pushed these wounds from serious to genuinely dreaded. The wound itself, a clean puncture, was survivable. The Viet Cong made sure the wounds were rarely clean. They smeared the stakes with whatever would foul a puncture deep inside the body. Mud from the rice paddies, rotting plant matter, and most often animal or human waste. The point was not the cut. The point was what the cut carried. In the heat and humidity of the jungle, an untreated puncture wound packed with that kind of contamination turns dangerous with frightening speed. Infection sets in within hours. What started as a stake through the foot becomes a fever, then a wound that will not close, then the very real risk of losing the limb, and in the worst cases, losing the man long after he left the battlefield. A soldier could survive the trap and still be defeated by it days later in a hospital bed. The bamboo opened the door. The infection did the work. And once word of that spread through the ranks, the punji stake stopped being a physical threat and became something that lived in every soldier's head. And the punji stake was only the beginning of what was waiting in that jungle. If you want the full picture of the traps the Viet Cong built, the ones that get even more ingenious and more terrifying than this, leave a comment telling me which Vietnam trap unsettles you the most, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's get back to the ground, because this is where the title of this video earns its name. We tend to imagine the fear of war as the fear of the enemy. A face, a muzzle flash, an ambush you can at least shoot back at. The punji stake offered none of that. There was no one to fight, there was no warning. There was only the dirt under your boots and the knowledge that it might be hiding something. And that is a very particular kind of fear, the kind that does not spike and fade, but sits with you every single second you are on your feet. Veterans who walked those trails described it in almost identical terms. The constant downward stare, the way a patrol's pace would drop to a crawl in suspected ground, every man testing the earth before trusting it with his weight. The job nobody wanted, walking point at the front of the column, where the man's entire role was to find the danger first, often with his own body. Imagine doing that for hours, then days, then months. Imagine that the most ordinary act a human being performs taking a step forward has become the most dangerous decision you make all day. That is what it means to fear the ground. It is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the legs and everything to do with the mind, and it wore men down long before any stake ever touched them. And the dread did not stay out on the trail. It followed men back into camp, into the quiet hours before the next patrol, when they would lace their boots a little tighter and say a little less than usual. A unit that has lost a man to the ground does not move the same way afterward. It hesitates, it second guesses. It spends part of its attention, every single minute, on the dirt instead of on the enemy. And that divided attention is exactly what the trap was built to create. This is the quiet truth that the gore of these stories usually hides. For every soldier who stepped on a punji stake, there were many more who never did but who carried the fear of it the entire time, who flinched at soft soil, who lost sleep over the next patrol. The weapon worked on them too. It did not need to draw blood to win. It only needed them to believe that it might. So how does the most powerful military on the planet respond to a sharpened stick? The answer is one of the strangest and most revealing details of the entire war. They redesigned the boot. The standard jungle boots American soldiers wore were modified to include a flexible steel insole, a thin plate of metal built into the sole specifically to stop a punji stake from punching through the foot. Stop and think about what that represents. An industrial superpower, with aircraft carriers and supersonic jets, found itself engineering a piece of armor into footwear to defend against a weapon made of bamboo and patience. There is no clearer picture of asymmetric warfare than that. One side spent almost nothing. The other side had to spend and adapt and spend again, just to keep walking. And every dollar and every hour poured into that adaptation was a small, silent victory for the people who had buried the stakes, because it proved that their crude little weapon was worth taking seriously. And even that was only a partial fix. The plate protected the bottom of the foot, but the larger traps, the deeper pits with longer stakes, could still strike the leg above the boot. Tactics had to change too. Patrols moved more slowly and more carefully. Engineers and point men learned to read the ground for the faint, unnatural signs of a disturbed surface. The Americans got better at finding them, no question, but you cannot win that exchange. Every trap found and disarmed cost the patrol time and nerves. Every trap missed costed a man. And the side building the traps could always build more, for free, faster than the other side could ever clear them. The wider consequences reached far beyond any single wounded soldier. Across the war, mines and booby traps of all kinds, with the punji stake among the most common in the early years, accounted for a significant share of American casualties. And that fact shaped how the war felt to the men who fought it. It bred a deep, grinding suspicion of the very landscape, and sometimes of the people in it, because the farmer smiling beside the trail might have been the one who set the trap the night before. That suspicion poisoned trust, hardened attitudes, and fed a sense among many soldiers that there was no safe ground and no clear front line. In a war already short on clear answers, the punji stake added one more layer of dread to everything. That is the real legacy of this weapon. Not the body count, which was modest compared to bombs and bullets, but the psychological and strategic weight it carried for a fraction of the cost. It proved a lesson that has echoed through every conflict since. You do not always need to overpower a stronger enemy. Sometimes you only need to make every step they take expensive, exhausting, and uncertain, and let their own strength wear itself out against the ground. And so we arrive back where we started, with a boot coming down on soft jungle floor, and we can finally see the whole picture clearly. The punji stake was never just a sharpened piece of bamboo. It was an argument made in wood and dirt, that the will to fight is more fragile than the body that carries it. It went after the one thing all the firepower in the world could not protect, the soldier's confidence in the ground beneath him. It turned walking into gambling. It turned rest into vigilance. It turned a country's own earth into a weapon that never slept and never ran out of ammunition. The most advanced army in history could armor the foot, but it could never quite armor the mind. And the people who built these traps understood that better than anyone. That is why a weapon this primitive belongs in the same conversation as the helicopters and the jets. Because in the end, it was aimed at something none of those machines could defend. But the punji stake had one major weakness. It waited in the open ground in the light of day, and a careful eye and a steel-soled boot could eventually learn to find it. The Viet Cong knew this, so they took their genius for traps somewhere the Americans could not simply look down and watch their step. They took it underground into a vast, hidden world of tunnels beneath the jungle, where the darkness itself did the hiding, and where the traps waiting in the black were more terrifying than anything ever buried in a trail. That is where we are going next. So if the ground above frightened you, Wait until you see what was waiting below it.